Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the So Happy Together podcast, the space where we unmask modern dating and relationships. I'm your host, Ellie, and I'm so glad to have you here today. Can't believe we're in our second episode already. In this episode, we're going to be diving into boundaries. And honestly, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about because boundaries shape how we connect, how we protect ourselves, and how we build healthier relationships. Boundaries often sound simple when we talk about them, but living them out is a completely different story. Before we really dive into today's episode, I'd like to start off with a brief exercise. Wherever you are right now, just take a moment to settle in. You're welcome to close your eyes if that feels safe and comfortable. If not, keeping them open is perfectly okay. Now, I want you to imagine that you're driving a car. There's something very different about this car, though. It has no dashboard, there's no gas gauge, no speedometer, and no warning lights. The car is still moving forward, but you have no idea how fast you're going, when you might run out of fuel, if the engine is overheating, or if you're about to crash at any moment. Take a second and really sit with how unsettling that feels. Driving without any information, without any signals, without any sense of what's coming next. That fear you're feeling, that's what dating without boundaries feels like. Boundaries give us information. They tell us what's safe, what's available, and what's not. And this doesn't just apply to romantic relationships. It shows up in family dynamics, friendships, and even at work. Relationships rely on our clarity. And when information is missing, whether intentionally or unintentionally, our emotional expectations become very blurred. Without clear expectations, we're left guessing, overfunctioning, and constantly bracing for impact. You don't know what's being asked of you. You don't know what you're allowed to need from the other person, and you don't know how you're supposed to respond. And that uncertainty forces you to do the regulating work that the relationship itself should be helping with. And just like the car I mentioned earlier, you're still moving, you're trying, you're showing up, you're connecting, but you don't know when you're about to hit empty until you're already stranded on the side of the road. A relationship without direction doesn't just create anxiety. It often requires you to abandon your boundaries just to stay in it. Any connection that only works when you have to override yourself isn't actually working, no matter what you're trying to tell yourself. For many of us, boundaries weren't modeled as something healthy. They were framed as ultimatums, walls, or acts of rejection, rather than acts of self-respect. For me, boundaries absolutely carried a negative connotation, and that made it really hard to want to set them. That connects directly to my anxious attachment style, because in my mind, setting boundaries felt like risking losing someone. And some really common negative feelings around boundary setting come from the way boundaries get confused with rejection. A lot of people grew up in environments where closeness meant access, where love didn't have much room for limits. So saying no, asking for space, or expressing a need may have been met with guilt, emotional withdrawal, or some kind of punishment. And when that's the environment you learned in, your nervous system doesn't hear a boundary as something neutral. It hears it as a threat to connection. But here's the important part. That negative association with boundaries is usually learned. It's not an inherent part of who you are. It's something you picked up along the way, often in relationships where safety, consistency, or emotional clarity were missing. Boundaries tend to disrupt unspoken dynamics. This can happen in families, friendships, and romantic relationships. When someone sets a boundary, it can challenge long-standing roles and expose imbalances in those relationships. And that discomfort often is labeled as selfish, cold, or mean by the individuals in those systems. Not because the person setting the boundary is doing something wrong, but because the system they're in benefited from them not having one. Culturally, we also place a huge emphasis on being likable, especially for women, and it's often at the expense of self-respect. We're taught to be agreeable, accommodating, and easy to be around rather than be clear about our needs. And when likability is rewarded more than self-respect, boundaries will always feel risky, even when they're necessary. All of this actually pulls us further away from what boundaries are really for, which is simple clarity in relationships. So before we go any further, I want to be really clear about what boundaries are not. Boundaries are not a punishment. They're not ultimatums. They're not a way to control or change someone else. And they're not emotional walls meant to keep people out. Boundaries are information for the other person in your relationship. They let someone know what you will and will not tolerate. They're self-defining. They create emotional safety, and they help build a roadmap for how you can stay connected with your partner without losing pieces of yourself. Boundaries will not push away people who genuinely want to be there. If anything, they show someone how to stay in the relationship. And one of my first real experiences learning how to set boundaries came when I picked up a book by one of my now favorite authors, Set Boundaries, Find Peace by Nidra Glover Tawwab. It was released in 2021 and became a bestseller, and honestly for good reason. The book is very accessible. It's not overwhelming or overly clinical. It's structured into clear sections and categories so it doesn't feel like one long, drawn-out read. There's also a workbook and a card game that can be used alongside it, which makes the concepts feel much more practical and usable in real life. What makes the book even more impactful is that it's grounded in her own lived experience. She talks openly about her ACE score. ACE scores are short for adverse childhood experiences, and they're a way professionals in mental health and medical fields measure exposure to things like abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction during childhood. These scores help identify potential risk factors for emotional and physical health challenges that could show up later on in life. For anyone listening who hasn't taken an ACE questionnaire before, or maybe you've administered one with a client, scores typically range from 0 to 10. A score between 0 and 3 is generally considered lower risk, while scores of 4 or higher are considered elevated and associated with increased long-term health and relational risk. And understanding this context matters because boundaries aren't just a communication skill. For many people, they're a trauma-informed way of creating safety where it was once missing. People who grow up with higher ACE scores often learn one core survival skill. They need to adapt at all cost. They learn how to read rooms. They learn how to anticipate other people's moods. They learn how to stay agreeable to maintain peace, even when it means ignoring their own needs. So when Nidra Glover Tawwab shared that she didn't see her trauma as the end of her story, that really mattered to me. She wrote Set Boundaries, Find Peace not to teach people how to control others, but to help people who've experienced trauma or who learned that boundaries weren't allowed to stop self-abandoning and start creating a sense of security in their relationships. And if you spent most of your life adapting just to stay connected, learning boundaries can feel unfamiliar, but it can be incredibly healing. This is such a meaningful integration of attachment, trauma, and hope. You're not just teaching boundaries, you're reframing them as a way to repair. Boundaries aren't about changing someone else's behavior. They're about changing how you respond to someone else's behavior. And I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. You do not have the ability to control anyone else. The only thing you can control is yourself and how you respond. I mentioned earlier that Set Boundaries, Find Peace came out in 2021. I didn't actually start reading it until 2023. By that point, I had been on dating apps for a long time with very little success, and honestly, I felt completely disconnected from the people I was meeting. I talked to someone, we'd go on 1 or 2 dates, and then things would just fizzle out. And instead of thinking maybe this just wasn't a match, my mind always went to, what's wrong with me? What am I doing wrong? Dating started to create a lot of anxiety for me because I wasn't staying true to myself. At that point, I didn't understand my boundaries at all. There was no guidance around what I needed or what I wanted out of a relationship. And because I wasn't communicating that, the people I was dating didn't know how to respect me because I wasn't telling them how. I was being agreeable instead of authentic, and it felt like I was wearing shoes that were too small, constantly uncomfortable, but I kept telling myself I just needed to break them in, even though they were never going to fit. Not having boundaries gave me a moment of relief, but the long-term cost was so much heavier. That short burst of comfort never outweighed the anxiety, confusion, and self-doubt that followed. And what I learned is that avoiding discomfort doesn't eliminate it. It just postpones it and makes it more expensive later. In my first episode, I referenced the most recent relationship I had gotten out of, one where I ignored my own needs out of fear of losing the person I was with. My partner had emotionally detached for weeks. He told me he was stressed and that he needed space. And at first, I respected that because, to a degree, defined space can actually be healthy. But this space wasn't defined. And in that uncertainty, I wasn't helping myself. I was standing in emotional quicksand. The longer I waited, the deeper I sank. His words said one thing, but his actions said another. And instead of trusting what I was experiencing, I continued to make excuses for his actions. I wanted to hold on to the hope that what he was saying was true and that what I was feeling wasn't the reality. During this time, I also minimized what I was going through. Confrontation felt terrifying, not because I didn't know what I needed to say, but because saying it might confirm what I already felt. And I didn't know if I was emotionally ready to handle that outcome. Not easily, just at all. What I learned from that relationship is this. If I'm afraid to communicate my needs because I might lose someone, I'm already losing myself. And boundaries don't guarantee that somebody will stay with you, but they do guarantee self-respect. And as I've said before, the only thing you can truly control is what you communicate. Whether someone can meet you there, that part is up to them. The first type of boundary I want to talk about, and this is a big one, are physical boundaries. So physical boundaries are the limits we set around our body, our personal space, and physical touch. They define who can touch you, how, when, and under what circumstances. This includes things like personal space, affection, sexual touch, physical closeness, and the pace of physical intimacy, which is especially important in dating. You always have the right to say yes, no, or not yet when it comes to your body without providing any explanation. I want to remind everyone listening, you do not owe anyone an explanation beyond no or I'm not comfortable. As my therapist once told me, no is a complete sentence, especially with physical boundaries. You never have to explain why you don't want someone to touch you. I've been on dates where men have tried to push or dismiss my physical boundaries by saying things like, I was just joking, or I can't help myself. And I want to be very clear about this because this is not okay. That's not flirting. It's not chemistry. It's not overflowing desire. That is someone testing a locked door to see if it will open. They knock lightly at first, then they jiggle the handle, then they laugh it off. Like, oh wow, I guess the door is just stuck. But they're watching to see if you'll unlock it for them, if you'll explain yourself, if you'll minimize your discomfort to keep things smooth. And if you do, that becomes reinforcement to keep pushing. Boundaries are not crossed out of nowhere. They're crossed after someone learns they can. Once you stop over-explaining and hold firm, things change. Not slowly, but quickly. Boundaries filter people out. And honestly, why would you want to be with someone who doesn't respect your needs or your body? People who are going to respect you don't need convincing. They don't need jokes. They don't need a second try. They adjust their behavior. They check in. They ask what you're comfortable with. If someone doesn't respect your boundary, that reveals their character early, and that is a gift, even if it doesn't feel like one at first. You're learning who does not belong in your life. Setting physical boundaries doesn't have to be an argument. You can say, I'm not comfortable with that. I'd like to slow this down, or I need more space. You can also simply move your body away. And yes, you can just say no, thank you. You don't need to add anything else. You also need to listen to what your body is telling you. If your chest feels tight, your anxiety increases, your stomach drops, or your skin feels hot or crawly, that's your body asking for space. Your body learned how to protect you long before your mind did. It remembers that safety comes before connection. The right people, the emotionally safe ones, won't argue with your body. They won't push the door. They won't test the lock. They'll step back and say, I see you and I respect you. And if they don't, that's not a loss. If they do, that's alignment. When you choose your body over being liked, over being agreeable, over being chosen, you stop asking yourself, is this okay? And you start knowing that you are okay. Sexual boundaries go hand in hand with physical boundaries, and they are most often violated quietly, not through force, not through obvious danger, but through pressure disguised as connection. That pressure can sound caring, it can sound confident, it can frame your hesitation as confusion instead of clarity. I experienced sexual pressure as early as 18, engaging in sex I wasn't ready for. My confidence was low, and my people-pleasing was high. I didn't lack desire, I lacked safety with my own no. When you're taught that closeness is earned by being agreeable, your body can learn to override itself, even while uncomfortable. Over time, that pressure became more subtle. It became more conversational. Phrases like, are you sure, were used, as if certainty is required for consent. I think you want this, as if someone else gets to narrate your choices. It's not that serious. Or, I can't wear protection. And let me be very clear, if someone refuses to use protection after you request it, that is not chemistry. That is disregard for your safety. That is someone prioritizing their comfort over your well-being and calling it intimacy. Sexual boundaries exist to protect you, not to make things awkward and not to slow things down unnecessarily. They protect your physical safety, emotional safety, self-esteem, sense of agency, and your relationship with your own body. Sex doesn't become more connected because someone pushes you past your hesitation. It becomes disconnected the moment you feel talked into it. Your no does not need clarification or justification. It is not an invitation for negotiation. It is not a challenge. It is not a mood. It is not something to override with persistence. Someone who respects you doesn't try to convince you. They don't rush you. They don't downplay your concerns. They listen, and they care more about your feeling of safety than getting what they want. When intimacy happens in a safe environment rooted in mutual respect, it won't cost you your emotional or physical health. You shouldn't leave feeling smaller, confused, or disconnected from yourself. You should leave feeling intact. Choosing boundaries isn't about being difficult, it's about self-protection. Anyone who frames your protection as a problem is answering a question you didn't even have to ask. They're showing you that they won't respect your boundaries, and that won't stop with just this one. The next category of boundaries I want to talk about is one I still struggle with sometimes, though with practice, I've gotten a lot better. These boundaries are time boundaries. Time boundaries aren't about how busy you are or how available you can be. They're about how your energy moves through your day and who gets access to that energy. Time boundaries are often one of the first boundaries that are tested in relationships because time is intimate. It's where your routines live, your rest, your work, your friendships, your solitude. And when someone wants access to you 24/7 early on, it can feel flattering. It can feel like interest, excitement, or finally chemistry, but it can also be like pouring concrete before a foundation has been set. If the foundation isn't solid, it will eventually crack. Some common signs that time boundaries aren't established yet include constant texting, expecting immediate replies, wanting to see you every single day early on, or feeling disappointed or upset when you're unavailable. These behaviors aren't automatically red flags, but they are signals. They tell you what someone is expecting from you, and often they point to insecurity, anxiety, or codependency disguised as closeness. If someone is relying on you to provide their sense of security, it is worth asking yourself, is this something I want to stay in? Healthy relationships don't rush your life. They learn the rhythm of it. They don't demand front row seats before trust exists, and they don't collapse your world into theirs. Healthy relationships allow breathing room. They can expand, contract, and tolerate some space without panic. And yes, as I've said before, space does need to be defined, but space itself is not a bad thing. We all need it, because imagine being with one person 24/7, 365 days a year. No matter how much you love them, that would be mentally exhausting. Things would go south very quickly. When time boundaries aren't respected, your life starts to shrink. You cancel plans, you stop resting, you feel guilty for needing time alone, you start explaining yourself for having a full life, and slowly your world becomes smaller and smaller. Time boundaries protect us. They remind us that closeness is built over time, not through constant access. It is completely healthy to take hours to respond to a text. I'll be honest, I'm not someone who texts back and forth all day long. I have too much going on. I'll follow up, especially if I'm seeing someone consistently, but in the early stages of dating, constant texting isn't healthy. It's important to have your own life, not rely on one person to provide all of it. It's also important to keep your plans with friends. A partner can meet certain emotional needs, but they cannot meet all of them, and they shouldn't have to. You're also allowed to say no to last-minute expectations. When I make plans, I intentionally set time aside for the person I'm seeing. And if my time isn't respected, that tells me something important. I know life happens, people get sick, things come up, but patterns matter. If someone doesn't follow up, doesn't confirm plans, or regularly sends a message at 4 in the afternoon asking to meet at 6, that may work for some people. For me, it doesn't. I function best when my time is respected and plans are made in advance. Especially with someone new, last-minute plans can signal a lack of intention. Making space for someone requires thought, and thought matters. For me, having something set at a specific time shows care, effort, and presence. Time boundaries also protect routines. I have mine. I work my 8 to 5, I come home, I spend time with my dog. Routines are good for your body, and they're good for your mental health. They keep you grounded. Someone who is emotionally secure won't panic when you're unavailable. They'll trust the connection because trust doesn't need surveillance. Just like physical and sexual boundaries, time boundaries reveal a lot about someone. How a person handles your absence often tells you more than how they act in your presence. Do they become anxious, resentful, dismissive, or do they remain steady and calm? I think of my time as currency because it is valuable. Every minute I give is an investment, and I ask myself, is this person making my life better? Are we helping each other grow? Is my time valued here? My investment goes where it's respected, and if it's not, I stop investing. The right person will never ask you to abandon your life to make room for them. They'll step into it at a pace that allows both of you to remain whole. The last main category of boundaries I want to talk about with you all are emotional boundaries. Emotional boundaries protect your inner world. They protect your thoughts, your feelings, your nervous system, and your sense of self. They define where you end and someone else begins. And when emotional boundaries are weak or repeatedly violated, you don't always notice right away because it often doesn't look dramatic at first. It doesn't always look like yelling or chaos. Sometimes it looks like empathy, like understanding, like being the calm one, like being the safe place. I actually dated someone for 2 years who I highly suspect had narcissistic personality disorder. And during that relationship, I slowly learned what it felt like to be emotionally erased. Whenever he had emotional outbursts, anger, shutdowns, withdrawal, explosions, I was blamed for how he was feeling. The language was always some version of, you made me act this way, if you hadn't said that, if you didn't need so much, or you're too sensitive. I'll give you one example, and I laugh now because it's honestly awful. We were about to drive to Missouri to visit my family. He picked me up from an internship I was at. I came downstairs briefly to say hi before I was done, and he just looked angry. I didn't know why. I said, I love you, I'll see you in a few. When I came back down later and got into the car, I spent 15 minutes being yelled at because I hadn't noticed that he'd gotten a haircut. Another time, he blamed me for gaining weight while he was going out to bars, drinking beer, and eating fried food on our campus corner in college. There was no logic. It was simply, I'm mad and you're my outlet. That's projection. Projection is when someone offloads their emotional discomfort onto another person because they can't tolerate sitting with it themselves. And while narcissists are often obsessed with themselves, many of them are also deeply insecure. This pattern happened consistently throughout the relationship. Over time, his feelings became my responsibility and his reactions became my fault. I was expected to manage his lack of emotional regulation. Eventually, I stopped asking myself, how do I feel? And I started asking, how do I need to act so they don't react? I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, and that wasn't love or connection. That was emotional captivity. Here's the core truth about emotional boundaries. They are about responsibility. And I want to say this very clearly. You are responsible for your emotions. Your partner is responsible for theirs. You can influence how someone feels, but you do not cause their emotional reactions. Anger is a feeling. It is not an action. Every adult has the capacity to choose how they respond. You are not responsible for regulating another adult's nervous system. In narcissistic relationships, emotional boundaries often violated through blame shifting, gaslighting, emotional dumping, withdrawal of affection, and making you feel responsible for their happiness. And because you care, you try harder, you listen more, you explain more, you soften yourself. You apologize for things that aren't actually wrong just to keep the peace. Eventually, you become exhausted and you stop recognizing yourself. Many people with deeply empathetic personalities are actually targeted by narcissists. Compassion without boundaries turns into self-abandonment in these dynamics. You can be compassionate without becoming someone's emotional dumping ground. You can listen without absorbing their emotions, and you can carry without carrying the weight of their feelings. Their emotions are not luggage you're required to pick up just because they drop them off at your feet. Setting emotional boundaries can sound like, I'm not willing to be spoken to that way. I can talk about this when things are calm. I'm not responsible for managing your feelings. I need space from this conversation. And sometimes emotional boundaries sound like silence. You don't have to explain. You don't have to defend. You don't have to engage. Not every emotion someone has requires your participation. Healthy emotional boundaries make relationships feel safe. They allow disagreement without punishment, emotion without explosion, and closeness without fear. Fear is not intimacy. In secure dynamics, emotions are shared, not weaponized. Someone can say, "I'm upset," without implying that you caused it. Accountability exists without outsourcing emotional responsibility. If you've been in a narcissistic relationship, you may have been conditioned to believe you're too much, too emotional, or the problem. What actually happened is that your emotional boundaries were repeatedly crossed. And even if someone isn't a narcissist, sometimes they're just an asshole. Either way, the effect is the same. In these relationships, you survive by adapting. And rebuilding emotional boundaries afterward can be incredibly hard. You don't have to fix what you didn't break. You don't have to hold what isn't yours. You don't have to earn peace by shrinking yourself. Your emotions matter, and so do theirs, but they are not the same thing. When you stop carrying other people's emotional chaos, you don't become cold, you become clear. And clarity is what makes healthy love possible. Before I close, I want to leave you with 3 questions to sit with. The first one: do I know my non-negotiables, or do I discover them only after I've crossed them? The second one: when was the last time I said yes when I wanted to say no? And then the third one: do I feel guilty setting boundaries, and where did I learn that guilt? Staying in relationships that violate your non-negotiables slowly erodes you. Familiarity may feel comfortable, but it's still self-betrayal. I hope this podcast was helpful. Next week, I'll be talking about attachment styles and how they shape our boundaries, attraction, and emotional safety, and how everything we talked about today connects. For the questions I gave you towards the end, I would love to have you tag me in any of your posts answering those questions, or you can send a direct message. Just tag me on Instagram or on TikTok at So Happy Together podcast. And if this episode did resonate with you, please follow, rate, and share. You can also connect with me on Spotify. I'd love to hear what boundary you are practicing this week. Thanks for being here with me, and I hope you have a lovely day.